Well, welcome everyone to this episode of Stories for Healing. As you know, this is a series that's been running since the end of October, inspired really by our collective assessment that things were just too stressed and divided and antagonistic. And as storytellers, we felt, what can we do about this? The answer is obvious to a storyteller: that's tell stories, but stories of a particular form, not where we say, here's the good guy and here's the bad guy, or here's the winner and the loser, or the right way to do things and the wrong way to do things, but to talk about healing and reconciliation and all those ways of coming together, of growing together in the face of some adversity. And so today, I'm very pleased to be able to introduce you to Steve Daut, who is going to tell a story for us. Steve, please tell us a story.
Well, when I was thinking about this, Jim, I decided that I wanted to talk about my experience in Puerto Rico. In July of 2019, last year, I spent a week in Puerto Rico working with an organization called All Hands and Hearts. It's a relief organization that makes a long term commitment to an area and they clean things up. In this case, it was Hurricane Maria. I originally went and volunteered for this because I wanted to I wanted to do something for the folks there. I felt like we as a country were really not supporting them very well. And so I went out, and the first thing that I noticed and that intrigued me was people who were doing this work. There were people all the way from my age and down, and there were actually some folks older than I am, some retired, some with families at home, some just out of school. And I was a piker. I volunteered for a week. There were people who had been there for months, years. There were some folks who had gotten out of school. They had an advanced degree, student loans out there, and yet they were volunteering for years to do this work, to work under brutal conditions and for no pay, risking their health. And yet they were willing to do this. And I couldn't understand completely why some of them were were putting their careers and their lives at risk the way they did. Well, the conditions in many of the places were very brutal. In Puerto Rico, it was not too bad. We were in a compound. It was like a MASH unit almost. There was chain link fence around it. And the conditions were there were three sleeping quarters that accommodated a total of 75 people. So there were bunks jammed into these little spaces, and there was no privacy at all. Uh, there was really difficult time to try and get any kind of personal space at all. And so there are a number of rules associated with staying in this compound. Number one, no personal liaisons, as you can imagine how uncomfortable that would be for everybody. The compound was closed at 10 o'clock for safety reasons, and so you had to check in and out. And there was a curfew, 10 o'clock curfew, and you could only use the organizational vehicles for certain kinds of business. You couldn't use it for your personal use. Uh, there was one evening class, they called it a low light photography class that one of the staff members held on Friday nights. And you could also use the vehicles for getting away on the weekend as a group. So a lot of times the whole group would get together. They would drive out to the coast and they would stay at the beach. They would camp on the beaches. You had to get away from this place over the weekend. We didn't work during the weekends, and it was brutal to try and stay there. So the work that we were doing was repairing houses. Most of the homes in Puerto Rico are concrete block. They have these flat concrete roofs with adhered rubber. You pour on the rubber and it adheres to the concrete. But this hurricane had been so strong, the winds and the rain were so strong that it had penetrated that rubber. In some cases, the winds had blown the rubber completely off the roof. And the people who could not afford to repair these things over the next couple of years with the subsequent rains, water had penetrated those roofs and the ceilings were covered with black mold, making people sick. So our job was to repair the roofs and then put on hazmat suits, full Tyvek with respirators. And bear in mind, this is July. This is Puerto Rico, right by the equator, sub-equatorial, and it was hot and 100% humidity. It was very difficult and backbreaking work. And when we put on these suits to do the mitigation, we had to scrape the ceilings down, and then we would spray this noxious chemical. And so, because of that work, there were a number of rules having to do with that. 75 volunteers, a 2.5 year commitment, and yet the devastation was so widespread that there was not enough time and resources to take care of all of the need that was out there. And so the company very carefully screened the people to make sure that they could not afford to do this work on their own. They scheduled things very tightly. If we took too long to fix one of the houses, then that would mean that somebody else down the way would not be able to have their house repaired. And the third rule was that we could only do the very technical work of repairing the roofs and the hazmat work inside. And when we did that hazmat work, when we sprayed that chemical, the homeowner had to leave for 48 hours to allow that chemical to dissipate. So it was midweek. We went to this tidy little house halfway up the mountain. It backed up onto the jungle. And the crew chief, a young woman, went up to the door, knocked on the door, and out came the woman that I would come to know as Mom. There was a bit of a heated argument and discussion, and then the crew chief came back to us and said, I am not quite familiar with all the Spanish language that she's using, but we have to wait for Roberto, who is her son, because Mom doesn't want us to go in the kitchen. She refuses to leave the kitchen. She's thawing some meat. Well, we had to wait for a couple hours. Finally, Roberto showed up, and he said that Mom did not want to leave the kitchen because she was making lunch for us. We were her guests, and she wanted to do that. And he also explained that she had a problem with memory. She remembered that we were supposed to be there, but she did not remember that we had to go inside the house. She didn't remember that she was going to have to leave for a couple days. Now, Mom had lived in this place for 50 years, and she had never been gone for a single night from this house. So the fact that we were going into her kitchen, the fact that she had to leave was incredible trauma for her. They were very afraid of what was happening to her because she was rapidly losing her memory and she wouldn't remember from 1 minute to the next what you said to her. So he was able to convince her that the family would get together. He took off work, pulled the family together. They set up an outdoor kitchen so Mom could cook for us. And he was able to convince her to stay at his house for a couple days. So we did the work. And 48 hours later, on Friday, Mom came back. And she was devastated once again. That mold had worked its way down underneath the beautiful flamingo colored paint of her kitchen. Now, the kitchen to her was family. Roberto explained to us that when he was 15, he had confronted his father, who had kicked Mom in the stomach and caused her to abort her child, which would have been Roberto's younger brother. Dad, when confronted, was so ashamed that he left and never came back. And not too long later, Roberto's older brother started going the same direction as Dad, would drink, become abusive, and finally they had to get him out of the house as well. But through all this, Mom held the family together through that kitchen. She insisted that people meet once or twice a year, or once or twice a week, once or twice a week to have a meal together. And she would cook in that beautiful flamingo colored kitchen. And so now it was ruined. There were streaks of paint gone. And Roberto couldn't do it. He couldn't raise his arms above shoulder level. He was going to be gone the next couple weeks. And so we realized that Mom was every day going to wake up and look at this devastated kitchen, and she would be upset once again because she would forget from one day to the next what had happened. And it didn't feel right. It felt terrible to us, but those were the rules. We had to leave. That was Friday. And that evening, I decided to go ahead and go to the low light photography class that they had scheduled. Well, there were 3 van loads. We jumped in the vans. We went down these mountain trails, winding back and forth, and finally pulled alongside this road. There was a pasture beside it with these longhorn cattle that all came up to stare at us. Moo. And we got out. Went to this little path down the mountainside. Vegetation closing in on us. It was slippery. And we went down, and people started taking off their clothes. Well, it opened up onto this beautiful mountain pool. There was a waterfall and rocks all around. People were swimming. They took off their clothes, they went down to their bathing suits, and these cases that I thought was full of photography equipment was full of towels. The only ones who didn't have their bathing suits on were us rookies who didn't know what was actually going on. So we went down to our underwear and we splashed around for a couple hours, had a ball. Next morning, I was ready to, I was getting ready to go on the shuttle to get back to the airport. And it surprised me to see that there were still some other people in the compound. Well, when I went out, I saw that it was our crew, and they were loading up a van. But we didn't work on weekends. Well, they were loading it up with ladders, with tarps, and they had a couple cans of flamingo colored paint. They kind of winked at me. And then I realized why people did this work, took years out of their life to do this, because that's what family does. And that's my story about my trip to Puerto Rico last year.
Oh, Steve, thank you. Thank you. What an amazing experience that must have been.
It was.
Yeah. Yeah. And these are people who didn't know mom, right?
No, this was one of the people, one of the families that we were uh, repairing their roofs for, and
Yeah,
mom.
but none of so this was just the kindness of strangers, if I can put it in that
Exactly,
term. Right, right.
exactly.
Yeah,
And I can't tell you, in fact, how many times people insisted, we got to make you lunch. No, you're our guest.
yeah,
You're doing
yeah,
this wonderful
yeah,
work for us.
yeah.
And we would pack lunches every day, and yet we never used them because people were just so grateful for the work that was we were doing.
Yeah. Well, and in my experience, had you refused their meals, it would have been a tremendous insult.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah. Wow. And it occurs to me, we are hearing more stories of this sort of when a disaster of whatever nature is encountered. It is almost, I think, it is instinctive to pull together, no matter what's been going on before then, and the divisions get left behind somehow, at least for the division, at least for the duration of that effort. And there's, I think, for me, there's a lot of hope in that. A lot of hope
There
in
was I will tell you that I was absolutely blown away by the caring of these young folks, and I came away from the experience just energized and thinking, what a wonderful
that.
group
Yeah,
of people that are doing this in a purely
yeah,
selfless way,
yeah, yeah,
uh, and it's a whole different atmosphere
yeah.
than we encounter every day.
Sure. Okay, well, thanks again, Steve. Thank you. Thank you so much. Everybody, now you know why we're doing these stories. We hear whether it's a fable from years ago or a true story that just happened or anything in between. There really is something about opening our hearts and our hands to others in times of trouble and being able to help move everything forward a little bit. Um, when we as storytellers tell these stories, it's a healing effort for us as well, because it really does remind us of who we are and what our humanity is. So I want to encourage you to go and listen to the stories, whether you find them on the Facebook page or go off to the YouTube playlist. Um, and share the stories, but even more so, share your hearts and your hands with each other, and find a way to bring a little light back into the world. Thank you so much. We'll see you next time. Bye bye.